Okay, welcome to our last Ask a Physicist of this semester. We will continue on, resume as normal next semester, so look out for announcements via email and social media, probably mid-August. And then this webinar is being recorded, and you can find it probably later this week on our YouTube channel, along with our previous Ask a Physicist recordings and past lectures. And then my last announcement would just be, if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can ask them at any time, and we will get to questions towards the end of the hour. So with that, I will hand it over to the director of the Beyond Center and moderator for this evening, Paul Davies.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello, everybody. Welcome back to Ask a Physicist. As you know, we like to approach these events with the quip and now for something completely different, and today is no exception because we're visiting a topic that I think has never come up before in the history of Ask a Physicist, and it's the topic of plant intelligence. And I'm delighted that we have a world expert with us today. I would like to say in the studio. We're not doing this from the studio, but he's not far away because he's here in the valley. We're going to have a workshop on this very topic starting tomorrow evening. And George Bassel, I get the pronunciation right, has graciously agreed to take part in the event this evening. So I'll say a few words about George. He's come all the way from the University of Warwick in England, so he's a bit jet-lagged, but his background is from Canada, University of Guelph, and then he worked at the University of Nottingham for a while, and he had there a Canada NSERC grant and a Marie Curie fellowship. He since moved his lab to the University of Warwick, and that's where he's investigating basically living systems and cooperation in living systems, and in particular how plants can do clever things. I'm not going to say any more because he's going to explain it all to you. So we'll follow our usual format. George will talk for about 20 minutes, maybe a little longer, and then we will engage in a conversation with my colleague, Sara Walker, and then we'll be sure to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. So please do send them in. I hope I get this right, through the chat channel. Or is it through the Q&A channel? So I don't know, but whatever you normally do, send them in, and one way or the other, I will attempt to curate them, and we'll deal with them later on in the evening. So without further ado, I'm going to ask George Bassel if he would kindly tell us his latest thinking about how plants can do such clever things.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Paul, and for the invitation to speak with you all today. So I'm going to start off with a presentation on this topic of, I was asked to talk about the question, are plants smart? Now, I'd like to preface this talk with the title of the series, which is Ask a Physicist. Now, I've been called many things before, but never a physicist. But rest assured, there are some other excellent physicists on this call. Physics is a hobby, you could say, for myself. So I just wanted to make that clear, that I am not coming from a pure physics background, but I'm a physics enthusiast. So the question, are plants smart? Well, the notion of intelligence is at least somewhat subjective. So the question as to how to define intelligence is pertinent when asking this question. There's this quote that's been attributed to Albert Einstein about everybody being a genius, but not judging a fish by its capacity to climb a tree. Puts this into perspective in terms of how one can define what is and is not intelligent. So if we were to extend this to other situations, plants are no different. One can look at this plant and some may see genius, some may see the proverbial vegetable. This extends to humans as well. individuals can be polarizing in terms of their perceived intelligence. And here is a former president reminding everybody that he is intelligent. And indeed, opinions as to his level of intelligence is indeed divisive. So when we're talking about intelligence in plants, it's important to consider their behavior and what constitutes behavior in plants. Now, they don't behave in the same way that we do, in the sense that they're sedentary. The way plants exhibit behavior is through changes in their morphology and undergoing developmental transitions. So I've illustrated some here in these images. On the left, we have a tree, and these the buds in the tree have been dormant through the winter, and we see the breaking of bud dormancy. And this is a project that we're actively working on with Sara and other members of this HFSP consortium we're meeting at the moment, is how the trees are using signals from the environment to decide the optimal timing when to break bud dormancy. Another major transition in the life cycle of plants is the decision to flower. So you have a plant undergoing vegetative growth. So as the plant grows, it will either continue to make leaves, and at some point it will choose to stop being in the vegetative state. And rather than producing leaves, will produce a flower. And at that point, it undergoes the reproductive phase. So this transition from vegetative to reproduction is a major phase transition, and again, is impacted by the genetics of the plant and the environment that the plant is in. As well, the germination of seeds and seed dormancy. Dormancy in seeds are plants' way of moving through time and space. So the timing as to when dormancy is terminated is absolutely critical to the survival of plants. It's actually the principal point of plant mortality, whereby if the plant gets the time or the place incorrect, it dies and the seed dies. So a very tiny fraction of the seeds produced by most plants go on to survive to produce plants, which actually reproduce themselves. So these are very critical decisions, and this is what we can describe as plant behavior, and likewise the morphology of plants in terms of the branching in roots. These are further decisions that are going to be impacted by the environment, the local environment, and the soil that the plant is experiencing. So when we're talking about plant behavior, we're talking about morphological changes. And also, unlike us, plants' physical form is indeterminate, meaning they can continue to develop and develop and develop. Our body form is complete at a certain point in our development during embryogenesis. And in the case of plants, they can grow indefinitely, and their shape can take many different forms, meaning there's a huge degree of plasticity in terms of the morphology and the behavior in plants. They're also very willing to sacrifice organs as leaves get old, for example, in the autumn or in the fall, they will shed leaves. So these are profound differences between plants and animals. We don't tend to shed our organs, at least voluntarily. Another major difference in plants are the timescales that they operate on. So on the left here is actually a live stream of a plant that's growing in my lab. No, I'm joking, that isn't a live stream, it's just a stationary image, but this is basically what plants look like as they're just effectively sitting there. And that's because they're operating on a very different timescale. And I'm sure everyone's seen time-lapse videos of, apologies for the sound here, of plants growing. This is a bell pepper plant, and look at it go. Wow, we've just 10x the excitement factor here of plant growth by watching it happen in a time-lapse format. So this is in fact happening in this plant, but on a very different time scale. So when we're talking about the behavior in plants, it's also occurring developmentally at a different chronology than what we're used to. And this has led to something that's been referred to as plant blindness, which is the human inability to see or notice plants in one's everyday life. And the notion that plants are surrounding us and they're actually doing dynamic morphological changes, they're exhibiting complex behaviors, but because they're operating on such different timescales to what we're used to, we don't necessarily engage with them to the same extent that we would to animals. And this is certainly true in undergraduate teaching. The extent to which students are interested in plants tends to be a lot less than animals, if only because the animal experience is a lot more dynamic and relatable than that in plants. So how do plants undergo these transitions? How do they make these decisions? Well, we can think about plants, at least the multicellular ones, which make up the vast majority and the ones that we eat, as decentralized distributed computing systems where we have groups, aggregates of cells, which are communicating with one another, undergoing some sort of an aggregation process and leading to some sort of a consensus or a decision. So this is true in the case of, say, a dormant seed deciding when to germinate, or the cells in the Stem cell niche in the apex of the plant deciding to stop making leaves and start making flowers. So these systems are largely asynchronous. There's no central clock coordinating the events within these cells. And an important point to consider here as well is the manner by which this consensus aggregation is reached to make a collective decision is unknown in plants. So I'm just going to highlight some general features of plant life that I think are noteworthy for this conversation without going into too many details, and seed these ideas for the discussion that we have afterwards. A feature of plant life which is unique to plants is the energy which they use to operate is in relative terms non-limiting. So because plants are hooked up to our star, the sun, they're directly producing energy from the radiation that comes from outside of our planet. So it's largely other organisms that are seeking to find plants to derive their energy, whereas plants themselves tend not to be energy limiting. So when we look at the signaling systems that are inside plants, they're actually incredibly wasteful in the sense that we see plants producing many proteins which act as repressor proteins, so they act as brakes to signaling. So generally in the signaling processes, in the regulatory networks that are operating within the cells of plants, there tend to be negative regulators being produced, things that are stopping events from happening. We have, for example, proteins blocking germination, proteins blocking the transition to flowering, and those are degraded. And in fact, a significant portion of the proteome, the proteins that are present within the cells of plants, are constantly being turned over. They're just being made and degraded. And it's incredibly wasteful, and we don't see this as much in other organisms. And that, I believe, is a byproduct of the fact that they're non-energy limiting in relative terms. The growth of plants is also fixed in space. Once a seed has germinated and roots are established, the plant will spend its entire life there. I'll show you an interesting example at the end, which is an exception to that. And as well, seeds themselves, something I've studied for a very long time, are plants' way of moving. So they do, in fact, move through seeds, but from what we're considering here in terms of plant growth, they are fixed in space. The decisions plants make are irreversible. If the seed decides to germinate, it cannot ungerminate. If a plant decides to flower, it cannot unflower. So these decisions are unidirectional for the most part, and that's in stark contrast to many of the decisions that, say, we make in our lives. For example, decision to marry can be reversed through divorce. There is no such option in the case of plants. So in the fact that, in consideration of the fact that these decisions are irreversible, in the trade-off in decision-making between speed and accuracy, accuracy is heavily favored over speed in order to ensure the fitness of the plant. So some other features of plants that are worth mentioning. Plants are capable of kin recognition. So this is a paper that was published in 2013. And what we're looking at here are rice plants. This is the grain of rice here. And these are the roots that are growing out from the grain of rice. And then these are the leaves coming out the top, which have been cropped off. So in panel C, what we see are two rice plants which are not genetically related. And what we see are the roots are intertwined with one another. So the resources that are present in the soil, these two unrelated plants are competing for these same resources in this same space. If we have the same experiment here, but between two genetically related plants, we see their root systems do not compete with one another. So these plants, in terms of the competition with their neighbors, are capable of kin recognition through a diffusible molecule signaling system. So this is interesting with regards to how plants relate to other plants in communities. Plants are also capable of recognizing themselves through a process called self-incompatibility. This is a system whereby the flowers produce pollen, and then the pollen germinates on or it lands on the stigma where it's going to germinate and fertilize the ovule to make seeds. So in the case of self-incompatibility, what the plant is doing is preventing itself from pollinating itself and encouraging outcrossing. So what this is achieving is an increase in the genetic diversity of the offspring that it has, in the sense that the plant is not pollinating itself. So the plant can either recognize the pollen right at the surface of the stigma and stimulate the programmed cell death of the pollen grain, or if the pollen tube does germinate in other systems, it can block the entry of the pollen tube into the ovule and blocks fertilization. So this is self-incompatibility, self-recognition in plants. A very prominent feature of plants, which has hit the media, is this notion of mycorrhizal networks. So we have, say, trees in a forest have formed a symbiosis with fungi, and these are called mycorrhiza, special fungal plant symbioses. And these mycorrhiza are connecting one plant to another through a hyphal network, which exists underground. So this has received quite a bit of media attention. The extent to which this is actually biologically relevant seems to be at least overstated, at least in the media. However, it is indeed an event which is taking place, and there is higher order communication between these communities of plants. Another feature of plants, which are physically not connected, is their ability to communicate to one another the presence of danger. So on the left, this is illustrated where we have a plant which is, say, attacked by an insect, and then the plant will produce these volatile compounds, which are then perceived by an adjacent plant. And that stimulates this plant to produce defensive molecules to protect itself against the herbivore. The idea here is that by signaling to their neighbors, they can, and having their neighbors stimulate their resistance to insects, that the total amount of insect damage caused to a population of plants can be diminished. So this is sort of a collective cooperation leading to the increased fitness of the plants within a given location. So they're able to warn one another of danger. Plants are also capable of retaining memory. This can occur with different types of stress and different environmental conditions as well. Here we're talking about dehydration stress. So upon an initial non-lethal exposure to low water stress, a plant will wilt. And then following the rehydration of the plant, it comes back to life. If then, I mean, because it was a non-lethal stress that the plant experienced. Upon a second dehydration stress, which is equivalent to the first one, the plant now has retained the memory of the fact that it experienced stress previously and has an enhanced stress tolerance to the dehydration stress. So this is something called stress memory. The same holds true for cold and for other aspects of plant development, that the plant can retain memories from its past experiences and to an extent, even pass them on to their progeny. Now, electrical signaling has been detected in plants. I'd like to show you a video of this. This is a calcium-based GFP, green fluorescent protein sensor, which is being imaged using a special microscopic setup. So what we're looking at is a leaf, and the leaf is going to be stimulated at its base. And what we'll see is the stimulation of the sensor moving through the veins of the plant. So this is a proxy for the movement of electrical signals through the leaf. And this is significant in the sense that, let's watch that one more time. So the leaf is flicked and we can see the movement of the calcium. So the movement of the calcium being a cation is equivalent to the movement of an electrical pulse through the tissue. So this is significant in terms of signaling, and it has impacts with regards to the capacity of plants to respond to, for example, herbivores. If a herbivore chews on a plant, it stimulates these electrical signals, and the plant will increase its defenses against herbivory. Now, this has been taken by a certain subset of the plant science community to mean that plants are equivalent to animals, and have founded the subfield of plant science called plant neurobiology. And this is really rooted in the notion that plants are using electrical signaling to coordinate long-range signaling in their plants. However, plants do not contain neurons. So this terminology and this analogy somewhat struggles in the face of scrutiny. And I mention it because it's very prominent in the media, and it's something we can talk more about later. But the idea that you can anthropomorphize or shoehorn the embodiment of electrical signaling through specialized cells in an animal to a plant system which doesn't contain such specialized cell types is perhaps a bit of a stretch. Not unlike this image, which I think nicely captures it, where you have a cabbage and a brain and a neuron coming out of the stem. It just doesn't quite fit somehow, but I'd be happy to discuss this more. So the question, are plants smart, or are they a bit more like zombies? Well, they actually made a video game to do just this. It was called Plants vs. Zombies, and it turns out this is a very good matchup. If you were playing video games on your phone about a decade ago, this is a very good matchup. Great game as well. So plants and zombies do have something in common, at least. The question as to how smart plants really are. This is a really interesting question. I'd like to think, rather than discussing the intelligence of plants, I'm more interested in looking at it through a information processing or computational lens, and asking the question, how do plants process information from the environment? What sort of complex decision-making are they able to achieve with the endowment that they have? And the way I like to phrase this question is, rather than asking whether plants are intelligent, I'd like to ask the opposite question, which is just how non-intelligent are they? So how little computational power or information processing capacity can plants have and still exist? So, I mean, and the question here really comes back to how much competition is there really within their niche? So there's nothing quite like a plant in terms of nature. They are the only drivers, only true multicellular terrestrial drivers of photosynthesis. You see a lot of cyanobacteria in the sea and elsewhere, and algae. But in terms of the land and the niche that they occupy, they're really the only ones. And they're actually the byproduct of two symbiotic events, endosymbiotic events, that being both mitochondria and chloroplasts. So the question is, given their starter's advantage and unique placement within ecology, what the selective pressures are that are driving for greater information processing capacity. So have the plants, another way of saying this is, have plants found a good enough solution and basically have had no competition since their evolution, and they're just sitting in a very basic quasi-lobotomized zombie state versus being these highly sophisticated, intelligent creatures, if only because they have so little competition. So I did a Google search in advance of this chat to say, what is the smartest plant? The answer, according to Google, is orchids. Orchids, the smartest plants in the world. And the reason they're saying this is because of their ingenious ability to trick insects and people into helping them. I mean, this is a morphological innovation. I would say this is just evolution as opposed to intelligence. They're able to mimic the bodies of insects to lure them into effectively a sexual trap to have pollination, but that is not something I would perhaps describe as being an intelligent solution. So then what else could plants evolve to become smarter? So if they have no competition, what else could plants do? This is an open question that I'm raising for the sake of conversation. Well, there is a very interesting example in the form of this walking palm. This is a palm tree, which is existing on what are called prop roots. So the palm is effectively standing up on stilts. So this is the trunk of the tree, which starts here, and these are roots coming out the base. And the tree is literally able to walk in space by putting out roots in one direction and lifting roots in the other direction. So here we see the palm in the bottom right image coming towards us in the image as it puts out new roots in this direction, and on the reverse direction, it loses roots. So if the plant is getting shaded, it can physically walk in space to find itself a little more light. And this is not dissimilar to John Wyndham's triffids. If anybody's familiar with the day of the triffids, this is another innovation plants could consider, is perhaps walking a bit faster and having the ability to eat humans. What else could plants evolve? How about some frickin' laser beams? That's another possibility. I don't know if evolution is up for that or not. What else? Who knows? And with that, I would like to conclude the presentation and discuss more. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, George. That was a great teaser to the subject. We've got some questions rolling in, but I would like to invite Sara Walker. So Sara is Deputy Director of the Beyond Centre, and I would like to ask her to engage in conversation, and then we'll take the questions a little later.
Yeah, I have a few questions that came up because it was very provocative, so it was great. And I guess one of my first one, which I've just always been curious about, and I'm really interested in your perspective, is how necessary motion is for intelligence. And you kind of left off on this on your last point with suggesting that plants need to start moving to become smarter. So is this one of the key differences, is just because they don't move?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess plants do move to an extent. They undergo what are called nastic movements. If you were to do a time lapse, if you remember the time lapse of the pepper plant, the leaves were moving up and down. Those are daily cyclical movements that happen in the plant. Day-night cycles. The plants will get droopy at night and then become more rigid and turgid during the daytime. So they do move. In the case of the palm trees, they're moving for the sake of getting out of shade. Is movement a requisite for intelligence? That's a difficult question to answer. Plants in nature either make themselves so toxic that they become unappealing to herbivory, which is the case for most wild plants, or they evolve a difficult cuticle or large thorns so that if something were to come along and chew on them, that they would not be tasty. Whether or not movement is necessary, I guess could growth be considered movement?
I don't know, could be. I guess it depends on what time scale we're talking about, the motion, which goes into your time scales point about how slow they are. Yeah. Maybe growth counts. So this actually also brings me to another question, because you talked about the possibility of plants on Earth, but me as putting my astrobiologist hat on, I'm always curious about how do any of the things that we learn from life on Earth translate to possibilities for life in the universe. So another question I have is, if you think life emerged on another planet, would plants be an inevitable outcome, and why? Or why not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So plants in our biosphere are primary sources of energy for the rest of life on Earth. So short of, and that's the reason I guess we've had so much capacity for life on this planet, is the sustained availability of cosmic energy, the light from the sun, constantly being funneled through plants into biological molecules, which can be broken down by everything else. So being the autotrophs provides a biological source of renewable energy. Short of that, I'm not an astrobiologist, but I imagine one would need another source of energy, perhaps chemical energy, which would be presumably finite, unless there was some sort of a renewable chemical system. So whether or not it was inevitable, I suppose if plants didn't exist, there could be finite energetic resources on other planets.
Yeah. So I have one more question, and then I'll let Paul open up to our audience. But this one also struck me about the plant neurobiology, because getting ready for this workshop, I was looking into all of the sort of different areas that people have thought about intelligence in plants. And I was really struck by this sort of tendency to do animal behavior experiments on plants. And I thought it was wildly inappropriate to do that. So, and you touched on that a little bit. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about your perspective of what would a science of testing intelligence in plants that was maybe uniquely adapted for the sort of features we expect plants to have, and not just ported over from animals, look like? Or do we need to build a whole new science of trying to think about intelligence in plants because animal experiments don't work? I mean, I don't know what your perspective is in that space. I guess that was a lot of questions, but you can pick and choose which ones you want.
Well, I think certain elements of decision making, I think, translate across the board. For example, this Fitts law, this speed accuracy trade-off in decision making is an appropriate measure to be using in the different contexts. Learning, memory, these are relevant questions. Problem solving, I think, as well, to a certain extent. For example, optimization problems. But the manner by which plants exist on this earth and animals, for example, the lack of motion, indeterminate body forms, disposal of organs, irreversibility of decisions. So the mode of life is rather different. So whether or not an animal style experiment were to be applied to a plant may depend on the context specifically.
Mhm.
Shall I chip in at this stage? Because
Absolutely.
talk on that. However you might choose to define plant intelligence, can you think of an experimental setup that could at least rank it? You know, that this plant is smarter than that one. Does that seem very likely that there could be like a pecking order of smartness among plants?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suspect it might go back to the goldfish in the tree and the context in which the plant was being challenged. So some plants are very good at, for example, dealing with arbitrary availability of water. For example, the plants here in Arizona. And other plants are very good at dealing with waterlogging and submergence and the lack of availability of oxygen. So it may depend on the challenge that the plants are being presented with to say whether or not.
One concept of intelligence that is fashionable these days is called social intelligence. And you've pointed out that plants, there is a sort of kin recognition, there's a sort of social aspect. So is that another way of ranking plant intelligence? You've got some that, really do a lot of cooperation with their kin, and others that shun their kin, that have low social intelligence. Or is this totally crazy? I'm just making this up, but it's crazy.
That's actually a very interesting point, because that kin recognition is not a universal phenomenon. Some plants do it, others do not. And the same is true for just about all the phenomena that I mentioned to you today, that not all plants do all things. So it may just be the byproduct of evolutionary forces and selective pressures as to which elements are being invoked by different individuals.
Right. I just wanted to throw in a comment about your exchange with Sarah about life on other planets, and the fact that plants are autotrophs. They make their own energy, or they use the energy of the sun, so they're photo-autotrophs. So as you pointed out, you can use chemical energy as well. They're chemo-autotrophs. And there is indeed quite a pervasive biosphere that is based on chemical energy. And you raised the question about whether it's sustainable on the long term. And to the extent that I understand this, I think the answer might be yes, because, for example, water that percolates down into the Earth's crust could be dissociated. I think the process is serpentinization.
Yeah.
And the hydrogen that is released is a source of food, and that comes up and can be combined with the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere to make biomass. And I think that could probably carry on for a very long time. So I could imagine a planet where there are no plants, and the primary producers are chemo-autotrophs. But that's just a conjecture.
Yeah, so of note, of course, is that for exoplanets, we're mostly looking for photosynthetic life right now, or at least that's sort of the conjecture, because that is the only thing that would be remotely detectable over astronomical distances because of oxygen production. But there's a lot of debate. So
If
yeah,
you're under the ice cap on Enceladus,
yes.
it's not many photons around.
Yes, so it's mostly we're looking for plants and exoplanets and chemotrophs in the solar system or something like that. It's actually kind of interesting to think about from that perspective.
Okay, well, now we've had questions rolling in, and I'm going to start with one that came in from Barbara Temple, who is probably our most loyal member of our audience. And George, you actually touched on a couple of things that Barbara had asked about, and one of these is sensing kin, and you pointed out this can happen. How much is understood about the mechanism, about the signaling molecules and so on that enables plants to recognize their own kind?
So in the case of the rice example that I presented before, they did recently identify the molecule that was able to do this. And it was a molecule related to the color orange that we see in carrots. It's actually a carotenoid. So plants make a huge range of these carotenoid chemicals. Many of them have colors. The color that we see in the fall, before the leaves fall, the reds and the yellows, those are the carotenoids in the leaves, which are not visible when the leaves are full of chlorophyll, but the chlorophyll is degraded, leaving the carotenoids. So it's a carotenoid-derived compound, and the mechanism by which that molecule is distinguished between kin and non-kin remains unknown, but it's a version of a carotenoid that has many different structures. And it's understood that this variability in the structures of these carotenoids is the mechanism that the plants are using.
Barbara also asked something you touched on, which is plant memory. So this is pretty fascinating. They can remember good things and bad things that happen to them. But how much is understood about where that information is stored?
Well, interesting question as well. That is relatively well understood in the epigenetic state of the genome. So there are specific genes that are involved, for example, in the response to stress or the control of the timing to flower. And on the proteins that the DNA is wound around called histones, and on the DNA itself are left marks. And those marks act as long-term memory storage of past events. And they act at the regulation of the expression of the genes.
So you said that with great conviction, and I know a little bit about histones and histone marks, and it's usually presented as being a bit controversial. But are you saying that that's a plausible hypothesis, or has it in fact been established?
It seems to be relatively well established at this point. So the first work on this would have been around 2004. And since then, it's been replicated in a whole variety of contexts. The specific modification is the H3K27 modification on the histone, which seems to be central in long-term stable memory in cold, at least.
Okay, well, let's move on to another thing that I am myself fascinated by. It comes up from time to time, and it's been asked by Ella Shiva, that basically, can plants live forever? And I've heard it said that trees don't senesce, and that plants are effectively immortal. But that's a bit of an overstatement, isn't it? So what is it that determines when plants finally meet their end? They're not chopped down.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So plants are unique in the sense that they can live for many thousands of years. I was recently, last week, in fact, in Greece, and I visited an olive tree that was 2,800 years old, which dated back to the late Minoan civilization. Fascinating. But the fact is that the plants are able to store stem cells, to have their populations of stem cells, which are leading to the production of new organs, new leaves and flowers. And those stem cell niches themselves survive for thousands of years. Now, in the case of a tree, for example, the only things that would limit the extension of the life of the tree would be disease, fire, or perhaps mechanical catastrophe, for example, the snapping of the trunk of the tree. But there's no reason to believe that a perennial plant, such as a tree, couldn't live indefinitely.
Now, there's a question from Howard about fungi, which, so you've contrasted plants and animals, but where do fungi come into this story? Are they more plant-like or more animal-like, or are they just in a class apart and not especially smart?
I don't know about their level of smartness. I would say in terms of their chemical composition, they're probably closer to animals in that they contain both chitin and collagen, which are both extracellular compounds and protein found in animals. They tend to degrade plant tissues. They're not primary producers. They're saprophytes often. And in terms of their intelligence, there's some interesting been done in that area, but I wouldn't be able to comment with too much conviction.
Okay, I'm going to read out a question by Lily. You used the word decision throughout this talk, and you certainly did, when referring to plant behavior. One of the questions that seems to come up around intelligence or sentience is the distinction between actively making decisions versus instinct or impulse or compulsion. And how do you define this distinction? presumably, I mean, these are my words now, presumably with plants, you wouldn't think that they arrive at decisions after some sort of period of reflection, that their decision making would be more instinctual. But then that's true of most human decisions. So that's not such a big distinction. But would you like to say something about that?
Well, I think
how they make decisions.
I think you framed that very nicely, Paul. Yes, that's true. This is coming down to free will and determinism, I suppose, which is a little bit of a stretch. Decision, I think, is appropriate terminology in that a transition needs to be made to the extent to which it's made consciously, or it's a habitual reaction to what the plant has experienced is a matter of debate, I suppose. Decision is indeed, I believe, relevant in terms of the fact that the plant is undergoing a transition, and it's not happening passively. It is an active process.
Well, let me ask you, it's a question of mine, not to interrupt the flow of the viewers' questions, because I've often wondered if you have a fairly complex plant and it's got to make decisions, it has to make decisions about a number of competing things. So, for example, if its environment changes, and there's a specific example in my backyard when I came back from a long period away, and a tree had fallen down and it had collapsed onto an oleander plant that was obviously very unhappy to be sat on by this tree. But when the tree was removed, it was in this sort of wonderful environment with much more light and better water, and we looked after it and so on. So this plant then had to start making some decisions about what should it do next. Should it invest energy in growing a root system in a different direction because it wasn't any longer in competition with the tree? It had a new source of light, so it was wanting to put leaves out in that direction as well. And there could well be other environmental factors, insect movements and air currents and heaven knows what else. A lot of parameters go into that. And I like to think, well, there's a sort of pie chart, and this represents the resources available. And these could be water resources, energy resources, nutrient resources, and that has to be divided up among all these different activities that the plant can engage in. And if it's really smart, or if evolution has honed its ability to optimize for success, it's going to make critical decisions about, better to grow the roots in this direction than the shoots in that direction. Put all your effort into this or that. Is there any again, I'm just making this up. I've just been intrigued to know how plants do this, because if there is some intelligent reasoning would be overstating it, but some intelligent activity going on, some information processing. There's no brain, there's no mission control, no nerve center. It's some sort of distributed decision making, which is of course known as well among social insects. And so, we begin to see the basis of a real problem about decisions. Well, I say a problem, it's an entire subject area, I imagine, of study. So have you thought about this? Has anybody thought about this? How do plants make decisions when their circumstances change across all of these different parameters?
No, absolutely. This is a fascinating area of work. Something I've done some work on, others as well. These really are optimization problems. And if you factor in as well the variable environments that plants are existing in, it becomes increasingly complex. So we have, as you correctly mentioned, a decentralized distributed system that's making effectively decisions on where to allocate resources, where and when, and also because, as mentioned, the timescales are very slow in anticipation of what future environments may be holding. So it is a very complex integration of different factors across space and time. This is something we're trying to understand with regards to root system architecture, branching, and in the project that we're working on here at ASU, the timing and the optimization of the timing of bud break. Plants as well invoke bet hedging strategies in the eventuality that they can hedge their bets across the distribution, for example, of different buds, of different roots. So yes, this is something that's being looked at, that the actual mechanisms by which they're invoked remain poorly understood. But what we're really interested in understanding is how these distributions are impacted under different environments and the extent to which you have, say, synchronized events versus distributed bet hedging in this decision-making process. So in periods of uncertainty, perhaps increasing the bet hedging which is occurring versus a more obvious solution, for example, the removal of the tree in your oleander, that it's very obvious that the time is to grow up now. These are very interesting questions, and I wish I had a very good answer for you, but the models we have are at least somewhat abstract still at this point, but this is definitely an area of interest.
Okay, now Ted Pavlik is asking, do plants outsource intelligence to animals that depend on them? And that's intriguing because some people think that we've outsourced some of our abilities to dogs since we went into partnership with dogs. That dogs can do things for us we no longer need to do for ourselves. We've lost the ability to do certain things. And it would be intriguing to know if plants have teamed up with certain animals, or maybe insects, to basically take care of some of the tough decision making.
Oh. Decision making, I'm not aware of. They've certainly established long-term symbioses. For example, there are plants that produce extrafloral nectaries, so nectaries, let's say, along the stems. And what they'll do is attract ants, and an ant colony will have a guaranteed source of sugar as the plant releases nectar from the stem, and then the ants will protect the plant from other herbivores. That's one example. It's been said that a lot of domesticated plants, for example, cereals such as wheat, have manipulated humans, and that we're being manipulated by wheat in order to propagate it, to make it one of the most successful plants on the planet. They also co-opt, as I mentioned, orchids, co-opt insects to do their pollination. In the absence of providing nectar, the orchid will mimic the female of an insect species, and the male will be attracted to the flower and perform the act of pollination. In terms of decision making, I'm not aware of examples. So I'm sure everyone's aware of this example of this ant, which gets zombified by a fungus. I'm not aware of a similar example in plants. There is an example of these patches in the forests in the Amazon, which are exclusively the single tree species. And it turns out that they're ants that will actually perform the farming event where they will poison any plant with formic acid that grows that isn't this plant that they want, this tree. So you'll have these monocultures established as a byproduct of ant farming.
Right. Now, we've still got a few questions. Let's move on quickly. Justice is wondering, inevitably, I think we all are, do plants have subjective experiences? Are they conscious? And Barbara was also asking, do they have personalities, which, maybe falls a little short of having consciousness. But do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer without having the ability to ask them, but it is possible to say that plants do behave differently, at least on a molecular level, from one individual to the next. So people have taken samples from individual plants and you can see they behave differently. So in my lab, we're able to monitor genes in individual seeds as they germinate, as they go through dormancy. And we can see that the path that every seed is taking before it decides to germinate is very different on an individual basis. Whether that constitutes personality is perhaps a subjective perspective. Now,
Hannah's got an interesting question about you talked about carnivorous plants, and I think we know about the Venus flytrap. Are they, if you do have a way of measuring intelligence, would you regard them as more intelligent than non-carnivorous plants? And I can't resist mentioning my own encounter with carnivorous plants, because there's a tiny dot on the coral reef off the coast of Queensland in Australia called Heron Island. And on that island, there are trees that trap birds. These are bird-eating trees, and there are signs saying don't remove the birds. You know, this is all part of nature's life cycle, but it's probably better if you don't take your children to see this. So there are indeed you know, plants that prey not just on insects but on birds, and for all I know, mammals. So you know, is that are they smarter, or is it just what they do?
That's an interesting question. They tend to do that in nutrient limiting places. Carnivorous plants tend to be in like peaty areas and bogs where there's not a lot of nitrogen available. So they'll be looking to animal sources of protein for their nitrogen. I don't know if that makes them smarter or not, but it's certainly an interesting evolutionary adaptation.
Okay, moving on down, Ken asks, could you comment on the dimension of sound vibration and plant intelligence? So I'm not sure I understand that question myself. Does it mean anything to you? Does sound play a role in?
Is that the one where they make the plants make sounds to scare away the insects? Is that what they're asking?
Oh, that's interesting. Or do they talk to each other?
That too. We'll find out later this week. We have someone coming that's worked on this. But anyway, sorry.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, maybe I think that person may be better positioned to answer this question. There was a paper published recently in Cell suggesting that plants were making sounds and they were communicating to one another the state of hydration that they were experiencing. So if they had water stress, that sound was being produced and perceived by neighboring plants. Other than that, I can't speak on that, I'm afraid.
So there's a question about electrical patterns. You mentioned there is an electric life to plants, and you use, I think, the word communication. Maybe sit up and pay attention. But this was communication entirely within the plant itself. They don't do they use electrical signaling between plants? Is that conceivable?
No, they don't. They don't have a connection between one another to do that. Perhaps through the mycorrhiza is one possibility, but I think that's highly unlikely.
Right. And so Ted has another question, but it's a little bit of a technical one. I'm going to come back to that if we have a moment at the end, because I'm not sure I even understand what I'd be asking. But so let me just come on to Devon. Any thoughts on ancient plant species coming back into the biosphere due to ice caps melting? So that's an interesting one. People are worried about, you know, viruses being liberated. Are there dormant plants that are going to reappear?
That's a possibility. There's an example of a 60,000-year-old species that had gone extinct from the Siberian tundra that was thawed and revived. That's a possibility, indeed. Maybe.
And there are always these cases of plants that people thought were extinct and weren't. And the famous case of the Wollemi pine in Australia, which was sort of a very ancient tree and was discovered to have not gone extinct and now carefully cultivated. So that's an interesting thought, whether there might be seeds somewhere, you know, in Antarctica under the ice or something.
And another notable example is the Judean date palm, which was prominent in biblical times, and that was hunted to extinction. And then they found seeds in the discovered tomb of King Herod, and the seeds were viable, and the species has been since resurrected.
Right. Okay. What else have we got here? So David asks, some plants appear more capable of adapting to climate change pressures than others. That's a very hot topic. Excuse the pun. Are those plants more intelligent? So we're coming back to this difficulty definition, or do they simply have evolutionary systems that would allow for adaptation? And then we have a political comment, which I'll skip over. I mean, this raises an interesting question about sort of deep memory of plants. So if in the past there have been sudden warming periods or cooling periods, and plants have come through that, you mentioned about how they could have a memory of what happened to them, you know, last week or something. But is there, you know, a sort of folk memory that goes back millions of years so that they're better able to deal with sudden climate change now? Is there any evidence for that?
That's an interesting question. So the memories they do have fade relatively quickly. So that with generational time, 2-3 generations, often these effects disappear. And in most cases, it's a very minimal effect, even after only 1 generation. The question about the plants surviving better through climate change is a very interesting one. And I would suggest that these may be not more intelligent plants, but plants that perhaps possess more information processing capacity in terms of their ability to respond to and predict future environments. They have a greater repertoire of response machinery that they can use in order to endure. So if we look back through evolutionary history, there's all these intermediates of plants that existed hundreds of millions of years ago that are still alive today. So if you think of all the ice ages that have passed, these plants are still alive, but we usually have a very small number of examples, but yet they're still alive. And people are very interested in studying them because these are ancient, extant living fossils. And they must possess something for their ability to have survived everything they have over that time.
So there's a third question from Ted, which I think is easier than the second one, which I'll leave out for today. He asks that there are a number of mixotrophic organisms, including those that can steal chloroplasts from algae. And this is apparently something called anyway, it means stealing. Do you think gaining the ability to make your own food from the sun puts less pressure on a non-plant organism to evolve intelligence?
Oh, wow. Well, certainly in terms of acquiring food, yes, that would be the case. I believe there are some photosynthetic sea slugs, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if
there are. But this is a symbiosis. They eat algae and photosynthetic algae, and then they turn green, but they're not themselves photosynthesizing. They're just in a symbiotic arrangement with photosynthetic organisms. And I only found that out because I Googled it today. I'm not an expert on this at all. We've only got a couple of minutes left. There's a question about soil conditions. For example, the moisture of soil. Well, presumably that does affect communication between plants. That they communicate better in ideal soil conditions than in, say, arid soil conditions. Would that be right?
May depend on the plant, if I'm honest. Some plants prefer drier soils, other more wet soils, so it may be context dependent.
Right. We really only have time. I've got more questions than minutes left. Let me keep it to the short questions. Do you think production and development of rubisco is intelligence dependent? Sorry.
I do not. That's a core element of photosynthesis. I think all photosynthetic life will require and depend upon this.
Right. And does plant intelligence direct the initial production of ATP? So is there a link between plant intelligence and ATP? I mean, without ATP, you wouldn't get going in the first place.
I think we all need ATP.
That's right.
Indeed.
I think we are down to the last one now. So this is justice again. Besides loving the extra CO2, plants generally like CO2. How are plants responding to climate change? So we hear a lot about the stress on ecosystems, and particularly on animals and fish and insects and moths, disappearing birds are dropping out of the sky, all of this. We hear less about plants responding to the stress of climate change. You've got like 30 seconds to offer a comment on that if you have one.
If we think about the evolutionary timescales that plants have existed on, hundreds of millions of years, and the variation in climate that's existed over that period of time, the evolutionary capacity to respond to a whole range of temperature fluctuations and just windows is tremendous. So I suspect that different plants will respond differently as the climate changes, and we'll just see shifts in the populations as has happened historically.
Well, we're well and truly out of time now, and I just want to thank our audience and to tell them that we will be back in the fall. with a program of different events, always something a bit different. But I would like very much to thank my colleague, Sara Walker, and in particular for our guest speaker, George Bassel. And we look forward to a productive workshop later in the week. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.